Hey guys, it's SoCal Val from WOS Wrestling. You're watching Wrestling with Regret.
The Monday Night War is considered one of the most important and pivotal things to happen to wrestling in the last 30 years. During that time, some of the best wrestlers in the world benefited from the heated competition between two major companies as wrestling gained a level of popularity that hadn't been seen in years. When we look back at this time period, we often think of the big names: Austin, Rock, Hogan, Sting, Goldberg, Foley, and so on. But lost in the shuffle is perhaps the most important signing that the WWF made at the time. A true unsung hero in wrestling, the man who set the entire Attitude Era in motion, Marc Mero. And yes, I'm deadly serious. Before we get into all that though, we must go back to his beginnings. Growing up in New York State, Mero was a star hockey player in his teens, later training to box while in high school. He would become highly touted in the amateur ranks, going 15-0 and winning the New York Golden Gloves 3 years in a row. Mero hoped to go pro, but an accident outside the ring resulted in a broken nose, which sent Marc on the path to become a pro wrestler. After training under the Malenko family, Mero debuted as a wrestler in 1991 and would sign with WCW that same year. Bearing a slight resemblance to musician Little Richard, Booker Dusty Rhodes decided to repackage Mero as a Richard impersonator named Johnny B. Bad. I'm not sure if anyone bothered to tell Dusty that Johnny B. Good, the name that Mero's new gimmick was playing off of, was actually a Chuck Berry song, but I guess it was a better name than Slip and Slide, Long Tall Sal, or Rubber Ducky.
Rubber Ducky, I'm awfully fond of you.
I guess we ought to be glad he was given the name Johnny B. Bad. According to legend, the Dream's first choice was Tutti Frutti. More appropriate? Sure, but still wouldn't have been the best choice. In WCW, Mr. Bad got off to a hot start with a big unbeaten streak. It goes without saying that Bad had a gimmick that more tactful announcers would describe as flamboyant or eccentric. Some, like Brian Pillman under a mask as the Yellow Dog, were a tad less subtle.
Johnny don't be bad, Johnny be gay!
Over time, Johnny would become a popular babyface, most notably feuding with Cactus Jack and later Diamond Dallas Page over the television championship. In February of '96, Mero quit WCW over creative differences and clashes over his contract. He dropped the TV title to Lex Luger on his way out and kinda messed up the booking for DDP's match at Uncensored in the process, as if that show needed any more problems. As was the custom with free agents at the time, Mero went to the WWF in search of a deal. Vince McMahon had become enamored with the character of Johnny B. Bad, but couldn't use it on his own programming since WCW owned the rights. Eventually they settled on Mero wrestling as himself, with the nickname of Wildman, carrying on the rich tradition of feline-inspired characters in wrestling. But mostly it was just a chance for Marc to keep bugging his eyes out, cause you know, he was wild. Mero's signing was actually a very important moment in the business, as the Wildman was one of the first wrestlers to ever sign a guaranteed contract. Before this, wrestlers were paid a rate per appearance that varied, calculating ticket sales, pay-per-view buys, etc. Add in licensing, and it was a mess to figure out what your pay was going to be. No wonder one of the biggest heels of the early 90s was a tax accountant. But as a side effect of how the industry was evolving, companies had to fork over guaranteed cash so they could secure their guys. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were the first ones to benefit from this in WCW, while Mero and Brian Pillman were the first ones to get guaranteed deals in the WWF. Mero made his debut for the World Wrestling Federation during a backstage interview at WrestleMania 12. In the midst of his promo, he was interrupted by Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who was either irritated or honored to be destroyed by the Ultimate Warrior earlier in the night, depending on which DVD you watch. Trips put his hands on his valet out of frustration, causing Mero to stand up to the Blue Blood. It makes sense that Mero would fight for that woman's honor. After all, this was the first TV appearance of Rena Mero, Marc's real-life wife, and honestly, his biggest contribution to the WWF. You see, not only was Vince McMahon high on Marc when negotiating his contract, he also took one look at Rena and believed she needed to be on TV as well. Thus, the husband and wife signed to the company together, and Rena was rechristened Sable. And the pairing worked too. Though it wasn't quite the same as Johnny B. Bad, Marc got to show off some of his charisma with the Wildman gimmick. Then you pair him with the stunning Sable at ringside, a woman who had the assets that resonated with the company's core demo, and it was safe to say the experiment was a success. After an unsuccessful bid at becoming King of the Ring, Mero became the Intercontinental Champion in September of 1996, winning a tournament for the vacant title that saw him outlast Stone Cold Steve Austin, Owen Hart, and Farouk. It's at this point we all put on our hindsight goggles and have a good, hearty laugh. Ha 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 ha! Mero's one and only title run in the company was short-lived, however, as he lost the belt to Triple H on an episode of Raw 1 month later. Mero would keep feuding with Hunter through that year's Survivor Series, where he captained a team featuring Jake Roberts, The Stalker, and some J-Bro named Rocky Maivia. Things hit a major snag in February of 1997, when Mark tore his ACL and was on the shelf for 6 months. While the Wildman was recovering, Sable was making a name for herself, planting the seeds for what would become her biggest year yet. Mero finally returned to the WWF in October with a new gimmick. Now known as Marvelous Marc Mero, he sported a shaved head and boxing attire, playing up to his past in that sport, which makes you wonder why they didn't go that route in the beginning. Well, yeah, I guess it's a pretty good reason why. Now, having a boxing match in the middle of a wrestling pay-per-view is odd enough, but not as odd as whatever the hell this thing that followed it was.
I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. Shut the hell up!
Eventually, these two completely different paths would converge, as Mero and Sable would feud with Luna and Tafka Goldust, leading to a mixed tag match at WrestleMania 14. This included some rare intergender violence as Sable super-kicked Goldust before hitting Mero's TKO finisher to Luna to win the match. If this match happened today, I'm sure they'd find some way to cram the word historic into it. As the months went on, Mero's character grew increasingly jealous of all the attention Sable was getting. As Sable and Luna's feud continued to their evening gown match at Unforgiven, the Marvelous One interfered in the match, allowing Luna to win. Sable called Mero out the next night on Raw, which led to what would become a defining moment of the Attitude Era. While that moment helped Sable's career truly take off, Mero's took a crucial nosedive. The rumor goes Mark was penciled in for a series of matches on house shows with Steve Austin, the biggest star in the company. But Austin allegedly used his pull to avoid working with Mero after the Sable bomb, because hey, how could he possibly sell for a guy who got laid out by a woman? Goldust didn't risk losing any clout taking offense from Sable, since his character was already not meant to be taken seriously, but Mero didn't have that luxury. So instead of potentially making a fair amount of money with the main event program, Mero was relegated to being the third wheel in the feud between Sable and Jacqueline, who debuted for the company as Mark's new valet. Pulled straight from an episode of Jerry Springer, the entire feud consisted of the two women calling each other tramps, skanks, and hoes, and reached its high point during a bikini contest at Fully Loaded 98. The battle saw Jacqueline pop out of her outfit that already left little to the imagination, only for Sable to trump her with her now iconic boob hands. And at that moment, somewhere in a dorm at the University of Minnesota, a 21-year-old Brock Lesnar sensed a new calling in life. The angle carried on into SummerSlam, Mero's last major pay-per-view match, where he and Jacqueline took on Sable and relative newcomer Edge in a losing effort. Somehow this program carried on into the late fall, as the company resurrected the Women's Championship. Jackie became the new champion on a September edition of Raw, while Sable would eventually win it at the Survivor Series. Sure, this whole thing went against Sable's wishes to not ever want to learn how to wrestle, but hey, once you get past all the name-calling and the hair-pulling, eventually you gotta fight for something, right? Call it an evolution. Try as he might, Mero was unable to escape Sable's orbit. From the very beginning, his WWF story was tied in with that of his wife's, and if Austin didn't want to work with Mero, that probably meant nobody else wanted to either. But Mark's misfortunes weren't due to a lack of trying. He even volunteered for a gig that gave him a lot of freedom, new opponents to work with, and opportunities to make more money. But well... On paper, you'd think Mero would have been a shoo-in to win the first and only Brawl for All, given his experience in the Sweet Science. But unfortunately for him, any advantage he had was ripped away when the rules allowed for takedowns. Mero lost in embarrassing fashion to Steve Blackman in the first round, but was given a chance to return to the second once Blackman went down with an injury. This opportunity was also squandered, as he lost to eventual runner-up Bradshaw on points.
Come on! You fucking break!
Mero's final appearance on WWF TV was a November episode of Raw, where he put his career on the line against light heavyweight champion Dwayne Gill, aka Gillberg. Mero had the match won, only to get pushed off the top rope by the Blue Meanie. Gillberg won the match, effectively retiring Mero, well except for one last match at Capital Carnage in the UK when he got beat up by Sable again. In 1999, Mero and Sable both left the company, and while the blonde bombshell would eventually return as one of Mr. McMahon's many on-air flings, her husband was not so lucky. Mark would come back to WCW for all of 8 seconds in April of 2000 before reconsidering, then had a stint in the XWF, God help me for when I eventually review that, and even wrestled in TNA for a few months before retiring from the ring in 2006. He and Sable separated amicably 2 years earlier. Mero made headlines when he went on cable news shows to talk crap about WWE in the aftermath of the Benoit murder-suicide, but has since become known as a motivational speaker, going to schools all over the country to talk about the dangers of drug abuse and bullying. Considering he left the business with his health and seems to be living a happy life, I'm not going to cry for him, but for somebody who Vincent Mann was so high on at the beginning, how could things have gone so badly for him? Marvelous Mark's descent into in-ring irrelevance was probably due to a whole bunch of different reasons. There was an injury, a willingness to do what was asked of him at the expense of his standing, locker room politics, and probably some other factors I'm leaving out. Whether you like the guy or not, when you get right down to it, his time as a wrestler was hugely influential to the business as a whole. He was indirectly responsible for changing the way contracts were handled. He was one of the factors of The Rock's rise to stardom. He got his wife a job and she became one of the biggest stars the company ever had. That in turn led to the revival of the women's division and a lucrative partnership between WWE and Playboy, which for all its imperfections eventually led to the company putting women on a pedestal like never before today. That's right, you could even say Marc Mero started the women's revolution. Be sure to thumbs up this video if you like it, comment below, subscribe to Wrestling with Regret, and buy the t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.
Here comes Johnny B. Bad, and you don't want to make him mad. He's as pretty as a picture. He looks just like the